Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the ENA Open Network project, project initiation document and work plan for 2020. Hopefully you can all see the screen that we're sharing here on at ENA. If you can ensure your microphone switched to mute to avoid background noise and that your camera's not in use, and that will help us here. There is a Q&A function, not the chat function in the webinar, that we'll be using to capture any questions as we go through. And then we have a couple of placeholders for Q&A as we go through the presentation. So we'll run through some introduction slides, and then we'll have a Q&A on those. And then we'll have a longer Q&A towards the end of the session. We are recording this, and we will place the audio and any chat messages on the Open Networks website. So for those of you who I haven't spoken to on webinar or in events before and don't recognize my voice, my name is Jason Brogden. I'm the project director here for Open Networks at ENA, and we're going to share duties here at ENA with myself and Nigel Turvey from WPD, who will run through sort of some of the introduction and the closing slides. So, Nigel, if I hand over to you for the introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yes, I'm Nigel Turvey from Western Power Distribution, but I'm really here as chair of the Open Networks Steering Group. So in terms of sort of introduction to this process, what is the Open Networks project for those who may not be very familiar with it? It's a major project we're running here via a trade association between the distribution and transmission network companies, looking at really the transition that's needed to net zero. So very much the transition associated with moving to DSO and all the aspects associated with that. In terms of another main objective of the project is trying to make sure that customers can connect to the network when and where they want, cost effectively. So that's a very important output from us as well. The project is referenced in the Ofgem and BEIS Smart System Flexibility Plan as being an important aspect of helping to deliver that, and hence is clearly well embedded into government policy in terms of helping to deliver the overall government's industrial strategy and clean growth plan. In terms of the general approach we take to the project, it's very much this learning by doing. This is really trying to come up with the approaches we take, trying to trial those to see what works, what doesn't work, to actually get that rapid learning approach and decide what we actually implement. In terms of what's going on right at the minute, and the reason for this webinar is we've put out a consultation on the work plan for 2020. This is something we've done each year of the project, is to sort of forward plan what we're planning to do during the year, put it out to consultation to get feedback from stakeholders to understand whether we're doing the things that are beneficial to yourselves as well. So in terms of the timetable for that, it was actually published in mid-January. We've got a couple of webinars giving people the opportunity to ask questions, with the consultation closing on the 17th of March, and we will then update this work plan in response to the responses we've had from yourselves. In terms of the overall timeline the Open Network project has followed, as you can see from this slide, we started back in 2017, which is very much a sort of foundation year in terms of where the project goes. That was developed in 2018 in terms of sort of planning out the improvements that were needed, with last year very much focusing on trying to implement things and actually make sure we were moving forwards. And that obviously continues into this year. But there's very much a strong focus this year on trying to move towards standardization. We do recognize that many stakeholders want to have the same interfaces and approaches by different DSOs across the country, and hence we are recognizing that in the project and trying to standardize the way things are done and the way we implement change. Clearly, this isn't the end of the project. That will continue into future years in terms of making sure we continually improve the processes as we move forwards. Looking at the project from a governance viewpoint, I mean, this slide, as you can see, the Open Network Steering Group is sort of very much in the middle of this slide. But to give you a flavour as to the importance of the project, it does report into both the Energy Networks Futures Group and the board at ENA. The board at ENA really consists of the chief executives of the network companies. So it reports directly there and really emphasises the importance they place on the work that's being done under this project. The actual work from this project is delivered by a series of work streams shown in the green boxes, and very importantly, sitting alongside the steering group is the advisory group. This comprises stakeholders from across the industry, and we use that really as both a sounding board for us to sort of play what we're looking at, how we're moving forwards, but also to get feedback directly from them in terms of the direction we should take on certain areas. You can also see on the slide that there is a work stream looking at whole energy systems, and that clearly has a strong interface into the Gas Futures Group here at ANA. More recently, there's been a data working group set up, really in response to the Energy Data Task Force, and we recognise the importance of the interface with that, with what we're doing across the Open Networks project, and hence that forms part of this structure as well. In terms of how the plan for this year really has been developed, it really is taking inputs from a number of directions, particularly some of the policy drives from both BEIS and from Ofgem, in terms of they sent us an open letter highlighting the areas they saw as critical for this year in terms of development. But also there's been various outputs from Ofgem in terms of like their DSO position paper, their future insights paper on flexibility platforms, and clearly we also already had the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan, which all feed in terms of giving us direction in terms of government and regulatory policy. But in addition to that, we have things like the Energy Data Task Force, the significant code review on charging and access, where there are elements which are both Ofgem-led and industry-led, which clearly have a big impact on the way DSOs will develop going forwards. So all these things have fed into the development of the work plan for this year. They're actually highlighted in the work plan, but probably the bit I particularly would like you to focus on is the actual products that are highlighted in there in terms of what we are doing this year and what those key outputs are and how they might affect you. So that's really what I was going to say in terms of an introduction. Shortly we'll go on and Jason will go through the work streams, giving a sort of brief outline of what's in those. But what we're going to do at the moment is just pause for a few minutes in case anyone's got any questions that we can try and address before we move into that. So please highlight any questions you have. Looks like we've either been extraordinarily clear or but if there aren't any questions, perhaps we might as well just move straight on to Jason to go through the actual work streams.
Thanks, Nigel. I think what we'll do is we've got the Q&A up on our screen here at ENA. So If you do want to ask questions as we go through, please do type into the Q&A. We'll be able to see it, and then when we pause at the end, then we can pick those questions up at the end and answer them. So don't feel like you need to wait for the Q&A if you want to scribe something and put it up into the box on the WebEx. Okay, so first thing to do is just to build on that governance structure that Nigel referenced earlier and just show how we split up the work streams. For those of you who were engaged with Open Networks last year, the work streams will be very familiar to you because we've kept the same structure as we did last year. Largely to give us some continuity, that's absolutely key because it means that we can maintain momentum in development, but also a reflection of the fact that our work streams are defined to reflect key areas of priority, and it enables us to package up our bodies of work. So along the top of this slide, we have workstream 3, the DSO transition workstream, which is in this phase looking at those next steps for implementation of DSO. And if we think of the sort of key themes that we are delivering against this year, the first delivering distribution system operation and showing and demonstrating an implementation plan for DSO. Expanding local markets for flexibility, so that's where workstream 1A becomes important, and our development work there feeds into other initiatives industry-wide. Open data is another key element, and you see that reflected in all of the work streams, but particularly in the customer information provision work stream. Whole system thinking, as Nigel said, which is reflected in work stream 4. And we are continuing our work in workstream 1B around whole electricity system efficiencies, which delivers a number of elements of distribution system operation. It also delivers efficiencies for consumers as a whole by delivering improvements in forecasting, investment planning. And it's also an important area where we're looking at some standardization around future energy scenarios at the distribution level, which has been a particular ask from Ofgem in response to in their open letter and also in recent discussions in forums such as their flexibility forum. So we're ensuring that we're looking at standardization across all of our work streams as well to make it as easy as possible and consistent as possible for customers. And underpinning it all is our communications and stakeholder engagement work stream, which supports activities like this webinar, and to ensure that we're getting our messages out concisely and clearly to all of you, so you know what we're doing and how you can engage with our development work. So I'm now going to work through all of the work streams and give you a summary of the products and the development work in each of these work streams. All of these slides, we've picked out the diagrams from the PID that shows, there's something just coming on the chat, I think. Dan, if you just keep an eye on that. That shows all of the products and a timeline for development at a summary level. And then below this summary level, we have a description of all of the products that we are developing. So that gives an indication and a summary of what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. So below this, you will see a number of tables within the project initiation document itself that describe the products and then map out the plan. So if I just work down through workstream 1A, again, you'll see a key theme in here is standardization. And so where we're starting on product 1 is looking at active network management versus flexibility versus reinforcement. So where we're making those decisions as to how to most cost effectively make decisions on the investment or marketing of flexibility services. how do we do that in a coherent and consistent fashion, and how do we be transparent around the decision-making criteria that we and the valuation of flexibility services that we're using as part of those decisions. So that is the first product we're working on, and we're in the process of commissioning some consultants to support us to do that, to provide us with some independence, and also to provide us with the capacity and capability to undertake the work. So I've got within the chat room, there's a chat from somebody, Matthew, around the Q&A functionality not working. Dan, can you just give a quick explanation of where the Q&A function is in the WebEx? Is it in a simple button within the WebEx facility? Right. Okay. Matthew, if you have a question at the end, then that we're not able to capture through Q&A, I will. I'll press the speech bubble, is Lisa's comment back. So for those of you who haven't used Q&A functionality, please press the bubble. Matthew, I can see that you're unable to edit it. If you have questions at the end, I'll leave some time for those of you to ask and come off mute if there are issues with the functionality. Okay, apologies for that on the technology. Okay, so so that is the first product. So we're looking at ensuring that we have standardization in the way that we set out our criteria and undertake our decisions around the choices between active network management, flexibility, and reinforcement. The second product is looking at our end-to-end procurement processes and the assessment of tender submissions, and ensuring again that we move towards good practice and standardization for that end-to-end process for procurement. So this builds on the work that we did last year around the end-to-end procurement process and provides standardization and convergence on decision-making and processes into good practice. And then we will be implementing them and planning that for implementation. The next product, product 3, is looking at the existing 4 active power services that we've defined for DSO, and looking at the operational parameters we've defined thus far and look at what additional parameters can we standardize. So there is a table of standard parameters, high-level standard parameters for each of those services, and we're going to look to see if we can develop that to another level of detail and then update that into our common contract, which leads us into product 4. And this is an important, probably one of the more important products out of our flexibility workstream. We are going to deliver a single common commercial contract across the 4 DSO active power services that we've defined, so that you have a standard for all of those of you who are flexibility providers, that you have a standard set of terms and conditions and as much standardization as we can define in our contracts for those DSO services. So it will standardize those parameters we've already defined into contractual arrangements. Yes, we recognize that there will be some variations due to location, individual requirements for individual DNOs, but what we're trying to do here is standardize those terms and conditions as much as possible to make those contracts and those services as consistent as possible out to the market. So this is something that was asked of us, and we've changed from a sort of good practice for commercial arrangements into a formal standard commercial contract. And release 1 of that contract will be released in March, and then we intend to update and amend and manage that as we're going forward. So just because we've got a contract out, a release 1 out in March, certainly doesn't mean that it's baseline forever. This is intended to be improved and expanded to reflect some of these other new services that we're going to look at, the additional active power service parameters, and some alignment with ESO. So again, we're going to look at the ESO products that are out there, the contracts for the ESO products, and see where and how we might align those. Product 5 looks at new DSO services. So we've got our 4 active power services now. There are a number of new services that are being trialled in trials. There are also some service offerings that are out there in procurement for reactive power and other services. And what we're going to do is learn through this year for those services that are out there and propose new standard services for 2021. We haven't looked to standardise those early this year because we think it's very important to make use of innovation, to make use of learnings out of services and procurement processes for these new services as we go. So the danger of standardising too early is that you don't innovate and you restrict practice too early. So we are going to wait to learn before we standardise those new services towards the end of this year. Product 6 is around the non-DSO services, so looking at what other marketplaces might we facilitate here. It builds on some of the work done in the industry-led non-SCR work in the charging review, so looking at markets for capacity and constraints. And we are going to progress those through this year. We're going to work closely with the BEX Flex competition, the TEF projects and others to help identify exactly what data we might need to provide in order to support some of those non-directly procured DSO services. So that's a significant area of development to support other non-direct DSO services. In the middle of the year, we're going to start looking at baselining and reviewing our current work on baselining methodologies and report on recommendations for that. So we're looking to see where we may be able to improve and standardise our baselining methodology. Again, we're going to go to consultants to help us pull that together to help us with capacity and capability and an external view on best practice. And at the bottom of this, we have a couple of products ongoing on stackability and the interaction between A&M and flexibility, and also pre-dispatch decision-making criteria. Both of those are now out and published on the ENA website, and we'll look at further convergence around dispatch after the winter 2020 experiences. So all the way down through this workstream 1A, there's a key date in July where we will, like we did this year in our flexibility workstream, we'll take a cut across all of our development work, define where we are, communicate that out to you all, and undertake a consultation in July. So we'll do that again probably over an 8-week period to give you a chance to digest and respond. Also, an 8-week period gives some flexibility through the holiday season, which you've all asked us for previously. But we think it's very important on the key area of flexibility development that we're taking into account stakeholder responses. So an extensive public consultation on the flexibility developments will be undertaken in July. We will also be bringing our work for workstream 1A as well as all the other work streams through the advisory group, which meets every 2 months and has a broad set of representation across industry within our advisory group. And as Nigel highlighted in the governance earlier, that's an absolutely essential piece for us to get external input into our development work. So this is a very busy slide, and it's a very busy slide because we have a lot of work in flexibility development, and that reflects the importance and significance of our priorities for supporting both direct DSO procured services as well as supporting active markets that are being developed outside our directly procured DSO services. Okay, I see there's lots of Q&A coming in, so that's good. I'll make sure we leave lots of time to cover that later, and hopefully I can whistle through that a bit later. I was expecting lots of questions on workstream 1A, so that's good. Okay, quickly draw a breath, take a sip of water and move to workstream 1B. Okay. So workstream 1A, workstream 1B is where we've been looking at continuing our development work for transmission and distribution efficiencies. And there are a number of areas where we're learning from trials, regional development programs, and case studies being run with the ESO for particular issues between transmission and distribution. So again, there's quite a lot of external dependencies that feed into our work in Workstream 1B, because we are dependent on the output of some of those regional development programs, case studies and trials in order to inform good practice for improvements in some of these areas. So we have had some of our work that was planned in this area roll over to this year because we've been dependent on the output from some of that externally run work. But what we're doing is coalescing that here in open networks and ensuring we're communicating out a consistent view. So if I run down through the products in Workstream 1B, the first is investment planning, and particularly in this year, reviewing and taking the improvements from the ESO pathfinders and the case studies out there with Mersey and potentially the Pennine trials. So again, out of the back of that, we are going to propose changes to cost-benefit analysis and the NOAA process, and there'll be an engineering report and modification proposals that'll be taken out at the end of the year. I probably should have highlighted when I did my introductory spiel that, as Nigel said earlier, we are very focused on implementation. That, in some circumstances, that means implementation across the network operators to make change, to implement good practice, to make system change, to make data available. In other areas, it is raising modifications and change requests to codes in order to formalize change in industry governance to ensure that there is the appropriate regulatory scrutiny and regulatory binding obligations on implementation. So we've got a mix of implementation through system of process change and good practice across network companies, and the formalization of that change into licenses and codes through change requests and modification proposals. So you'll see in our slides and in the PID, we do identify where we're seeking to raise modification proposals out of our development work. Okay, and product 2 is the continuation of our work on the future energy scenarios. But there is a new element within this, which is looking at standardization of the distribution fares. As I said earlier, that has been a key focus from Ofgem, and therefore what we're looking at is how we might standardize DFARS in terms of process, timing, format. We'll take all of those into account in here and make some recommendations in the middle of the year as to how we take that forward. We have got an implementation report out on that standardization at the end of the year. It's very difficult for us to prejudge implementation timescales for any standardization of the DFARS because it depends on the scale of system change, process change, resourcing and everything else. So you'll see what we've defined in here is a scoping report that is intended to make recommendations for change, but depending on the scale of those change, the implementation plan will depend on that. So I can't give firm timelines for implementation for change, but what we can do is we can define the recommendations and how we're going to take that forward and then reflect implementation planning activities from there. So I wanted to particularly pick out the DFARS standardization as a new body of work that we've put in the PID for this year. And I'm going to jump to the bottom as well, which is another new area of work, which is around signposting of potential network capacity requirements. So what we recognize is that there are inconsistencies on how network operators are currently signposting network capacity shortfalls and potential system needs. So what we're looking to do is to provide some consistency and standardization for that across network operators again. So again, we're looking to pull together what the recommendations are for change, and then depending on the scale of change, we'll be looking at implementation and a report on implementation plan for that signposting of potential capacity requirements. So again, another important element that we've introduced into the PID for this year. Products 3 and 4 are continuations of the work that we were doing last year. Product 3, very much building again on the regional development programs and the OTS, the Operational Tripping Scheme, and Connect and Manage experiences through the regional development programs. And we'll be reporting and looking to make change off the back of those programs of work. On data exchange, we have published a report on data exchange this year, looking at how we might make use of the common information model. And off the back of that, we're looking to define code changes and monitor our progress of those code changes. So again, this is a good example of where we're raising code change to place the implementation of change through code modification processes. Again, if we're looking at external interface and influences here, some of these data exchange mechanisms are also included in the Ofgem LTDS consultation that's out at the moment. So we've been providing input into that. We'll provide a response back to show how we're seeking to progress the common information model in open networks. Okay. I can see the Q&A coming through, so that's lovely. We will leave the time for that at the end. Workstream 2 continues our work on customer information provision and connections. So an important implementation for us for open data is the system-wide resource register, which has gone live across all of the DNOs at the end of January. So you will see a link and publication to that on the ENA website. That system-wide resource register data is now out and available in consistent format across all network companies. And you can see that referenced from the ENA website. We're also continuing to input into DCP 350. I've seen from the Q&A that Lisa Waters is on the line, so good to have you online, Lisa. And we are feeding into Lisa's proposal through DCP 350. We didn't want to wait for the outcome of that in order to make improvements and be more transparent on our data. But obviously, we will change and adapt to any output that comes through from that change proposal, and we will maintain momentum on the openness of the assets. We do have a next release of that resource register, including network improvements, and that will be implemented in July. So that's the second bar down on that. So we're continuing on our theme of open data. And again, at the bottom here, Nigel referenced it earlier, we're also inputting and expecting output from the ENA Data Working Group. That is a cross-fuel gas and electricity working group, so we're expecting some of the initiatives to come back into open networks for us to consider for asset registration and other areas in the data working group when it comes to electricity assets. The other two areas of Workstream 2 scope are areas that should be familiar to those of you who are familiar with open networks. The first is queue management. So we have published our findings around queue management, and we're now going to that next level down, looking at a user guide and process maps for improving the queue management processes. And we're also looking at raising a custom mod associated with queue management. So that is about formalizing and more our milestone approach, and also looking at mechanisms for promoting flexibility in the queue to release capacity. So that is a key action out of the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan, and we have some proposals out there on that we're now turning into more detailed process maps and user guide. The next product is interactivity. That, again, is a build on last year. We have a high-level process defined for interactivity, and we're continuing to develop that into a more detailed user guide and process map. And we're also expanding that to look at different levels of interactivity, distribution to distribution network, distribution to IDNO, T to D. So we are looking at developing those further interactivity processes, building on our good practice we've identified to date. So that will progress through this year, and we're expecting a number of modifications and the development of the change processes for customer information. Okay, workstream 3 is our distribution operation workstream, and this is slightly simpler for us centrally in Open Networks this year, because we concluded in response, in line with the stakeholder responses on distribution system operation, we now have our model for DSO, ESO coordination enhancements backed by price-driven flexibility drivers. So we are now taking that model of distribution system operation, and we are looking at the practical steps to implement the functions and activities associated with distribution system operation through the next regulatory window and beyond. So we have commissioned some consultants. We've commissioned DNV-GL to help us pull together that distribution system operation view. And within the PID, it defines exactly what we're going to do, and DNV are helping us with the how and the tool that we're going to use to publicise that implementation plan. So that's a very important piece of work for us. It reflects some of the discussions that are going on within the network operators, particularly within ED2, and how we set out plans for implementation in ED2 for the distribution network operators, and it'll be a snapshot of a view on how, as an industry and a group of network operators, we'll be implementing those distribution system operation functions over the next few years. So we will be testing this with the advisory group. First test of that is in March, and then we'll progress that for implementation in the middle of the year. So we are planning to publish that first iteration in June. We're also continuing to ensure that we're facilitating neutral market facilitation, one of the key principles that underpins everything we do here at Open Networks. And we are maintaining our published conflicts of interest and unintended consequences risk register. So you can see that that is published on the ENA website. We are maintaining that. We are holding people to account for their mitigating actions for those risks. So I would welcome any input from anyone into potential conflicts of interest, unintended consequences or risks. And please do look at that risk register, add new risks onto it. If you don't believe we're progressing mitigating action appropriately, please do feed that in. Again, we will be challenging that through the advisory group over the next few months, but it is there and available for anybody to provide input or feedback into. So, please do review that log. We certainly will be within the program. Workstream 4 is our whole energy system. So this is where we bring the gas and electricity networks together. Workstream 4 and Open Networks and the data working group are the two key initiatives where we get that cross-fuel thinking at ENA. And this has been a bit of a flagship work stream for us over the last year, because it really has helped share understanding between gas and electricity networks. And we have delivered a report out of that at the end of last year, and we're progressing the recommendations set out in that report in the work plan for next year. So we're continuing to look at the investment planning work that was identified last year, looking at whole system optioneering, and also looking at whether we can do some coordinated gathering of regional data and reporting on existing network resource data. What we're going to be doing on that is collating what we're currently doing, handing that over to the data working group and say, well, how can we make improvements on our existing network resource data? In addition to that, as part of some of these initiatives, we'll be looking at whole system cost-benefit analysis to test whether there is a cost-benefit case for making change in some of these areas. So by testing that for some of these products, we can develop recommendations for some principles around how we build whole system CBA. And that is particularly important given the business planning guidelines published from Ofgem, where we've been asked to consider whole system CBA as part of our future. So we will be looking at how we scope up some recommendations for principles of whole system CBA work in workstream 4 as well. And then the last product, I've jumped between them a bit here, product 3, is looking at how we might be able to expand our work we've been doing on whole system FESs in workstream 1B and see how we might be able to include some gas input, further gas input into a further streamlined whole system FES. So again, we've made improvements to last year's FES process, reflecting the more regional thinking in this year's FES process, and then we'll look to see whether we can make further improvements for the provision of gas data into next year's FES. And that is a bit of a whistle-stop tour through all of our development work. Workstream 5, as Nigel and I explained earlier, is about communication and stakeholder engagement. So we'll continue to ensure that we are effectively communicating our work through Workstream 5. But it's not a content generator in Workstream 5. It's very important for us to ensure that we get our messages across well, but it's the messages associated with the development work that has preceded it. So, at that point, I'm going to draw breath, and we have a set of Q&A on the laptop here, Nigel, that I think between us we can work through. So I think if we start with the first question that I've got in here, which is, are we going to standardise flexibility products and find a single platform for parties to use across all regions? Maybe if I start, Nigel, and then hand over to you. I think we are looking to standardise flexibility products for DSO services, for directly contracted services from DNOs for DSO services. So yes, and we are looking to standardise contracts for that. A single platform, we are not looking to standardise a single platform. I think this again feeds into some of the work that has been set out by Ofgem around in their flexibility, in their insights paper into flexibility platforms. Also feeds into sort of some of their DSO conclusions in their position paper, where there's this challenge between what's contestable and what's not contestable and what is appropriate for us to do as a group of network operators and not. And at the moment, we're not looking to standardise that single platform. What we're finding is that there are a number of providers who are able to provide services to support our procurement processes, but we're not standardising that centrally in ENA. Is there anything you wanted to sort of add to that, Nigel, from a sort of...
No, I mean, I think the way I see it is the network companies being able to provide sort of information to any of these platforms about their system needs, and then those platforms being available to anyone that wishes to use them to actually offer those services via those platforms. I mean, clearly there's a whole raft of commercial issues there in terms of how those platforms recover their costs that really do need to be worked through. But we're certainly feeling our way at the present time, and certainly if I look at WPD, we're currently pushing requirements out on 3 different platform types. So and we're getting responses from all of those, which actually help us.
Yeah, I think things like the BAYS flexibility competition and things like that as well. You know, there's a lot of innovation going on info provision, and we will want to reflect some of the standardisation of our processes in the platforms as well. So my view is certainly it's far too early to be looking at standardising platforms. We need to learn from our experience of using different techniques, platforms, processes and everything else, really.
Yeah, yes. I mean, we may find there's convergence in the long term over something, but I think we need to see the variety that's out there at the present time and see what works.
Agreed. Okay. The next question is a good one, which is around, is release 1 of the contracts a draft for comments from stakeholder legal teams, or is it the final contract? Last year there were plans to send these out for stakeholder review before they went live. Yes, is the answer to the last bit. There were plans to send these out for stakeholder review. What we found in the practicality of developing the contracts is we're pulling together a number of different contracts from different companies into a standard contract separately. There are a number of different ways of defining terms and conditions. It's been quite complex. We've commissioned a legal team centrally here at ENA to define a central contract. But what we've decided to do is, rather than as part of the development work, go out to stakeholder review and have an additional level of complexity for development, which might have put off the release of that contract probably by another 3 to 4 months by our planning. What we've done is we have chosen to use our independent legal advisors to pull together a consistent release 1 contract centrally, then put that out for consultation. So if you look in the PID, there is a publication in March, and we'll run through this with the advisory group in March. That will be published in March, the release 1. We then have a March to July period where we will seek stakeholder feedback on that release 1 of the contract. Now, we think it's really important to start using a standardized contract. So we didn't want to delay the use of a standard contract. So that's why we've gone for this release 1 of the contract. But we have got that 3-month period for stakeholders to provide feedback into that contract. And the contract will go into a change management process here in ENA, so that then we can make change and reflect improvements on that contract in the future. And you'll see in the PID again, we've got a block of activity associated with updating the contract, and I expect there'll be a release 2. I expect there'll then be a release 3 to align it with the DSO contract, a release 4 when we've got the new DSO services to reflect the new services in contract. So it's very deliberately named release 1 because it's not a final and only version. And we've deliberately defined a stakeholder feedback period after the release of release 1 so that people can give us input and we can make changes appropriately. So we have changed our plan slightly on how we develop the contract. It's for expedience of standardizing contracts, and we've reflected that stakeholder review period after release 1 in March.
Shall I take the next one in terms of in P5? The question is, in P5, new DSO services, what does TEF stand for? So this is P5 in workstream 1A, which is all about new DSO services. What TEF stands for, it's just an acronym for 3 NIC projects, innovation projects, which were approved by Ofgem, called Transition, EFS and Fusion. And part of the requirement of those projects in their approval by Ofgem to go forward for innovation work was that they work together to try and collaborate and find savings. So, for example, the EFS project is very much about forecasting work, and that work is needed in both the other projects as well. So it was looking for areas where savings could be made and learning could be shared between the projects as they were developed. So that's all it really stands for, is those innovation projects going forward. So in terms of the impact on that particular product in workstream 1A, it really is giving a territory to do the sort of learning by doing really approach that we described earlier in terms of being able to trial things out in those projects.
Okay. Let's go up here because we've got some up in the Q&A. We've been looking at the chat as well. Question from Marcelo: to what extent are we looking to align these methodologies with DSO's NOAA approach? So DSO is an integral part of open networks. It includes all 6 of the DNOs, the ESO, the 3 transmission owners, and GTC, the IDNO. So our intention is to align methodologies between DNOs, IDNOs, and ESOs wherever possible through all of our development work. So I don't know exactly which methodologies are being referred to there, Marcelo, but as part of our workstream 1B investment planning development, we've been looking to make improvements and provide regional input into the NOAA process. So we're always looking to align DNO, IDNO, and ESO approaches across all of our work in open networks.
I mean, I think part of this is we're doing a lot of work in actually making sure we better align the distribution future energy scenarios with the ESO future energy scenarios, but also feeding off the back of that is how do you take those to actually signpost out the work that's needed. And really the NOAA does that economic assessment, and part of what we're trying to do under that sort of P5, the whole system FES product under workstream 1B, is to look at the processes that are done on that and how we actually signpost out, you know, what needs to be done, what opportunities there are. So to some extent, it does parallel that NOAA process, and really is a case of how we integrate all those together.
Next question from Matthew. Matthew was whether network charging will be included in the A&M versus flexibility versus reinforcement common methodology. We're not. We need to just sort of be clear on the boundaries between the work being done under the SCR on network charging and what we're reflecting in open networks. When we see outputs from the SCR work, we will obviously reflect it in our development work here. But what we're really looking at here is the decision-making criteria and the common methodologies for choosing between A&M, reinforcement, and flexibility services. So when we look at the valuation methodology, that will be looking at how we value flexibility. The decision-making criteria will look at how we make comparison of costs and charges between the three different options, and that will reflect the charging methodology that applies at the time, at the moment, sort of pre-SCR out. I hope that answers your question, Matthew. Have I missed any sort of angle on that, do you think, Nigel?
No, well, I don't think so. But perhaps part of what's behind the question is, of course, depending upon the outcome of that network charging project and how sort of access rights are defined and where connection boundaries are, could have a fair impact on, you know, the future of A&M and how it actually works going forwards, as to whether it just becomes, you know, a technology solution as opposed to, at the moment, it's both a technology and a commercial solution, because obviously it's giving the ability for people to connect at lower cost or faster timescales. So it could have an impact in there, but really that just depends on the outcome of that SCR decision on things like connection boundary.
Okay. Let's have a look down through the Q&As here. Is any work planned on looking at shorter-term DSO services? Perhaps you could comment in general on how the OMP is approaching the fact that different stakeholders have different needs around contract length. Well, contract length is one of the key parameters in the DSO service definition. So we will look again at how we might parameterize and standardize contract terms, contract length. At the moment, it is one of those areas where there are different needs, and therefore there isn't a standard contract length defined for active power services at the moment. There is some flexibility on how different DNOs contract over different timescales, depending again on their system needs. So we have been looking at it. We have been looking at whether there are consistent approaches. Up to now, we haven't been able to define standard contract lengths because of the different nature of the services being procured in different locations and for different system needs. So hopefully that gives you some comfort that we are looking at it, but at the moment we don't believe it's appropriate to standardise contract length because of those variations. On code modifications from OMP, I've seen a number of code changes like CMP 298, Statement of Works, and DCP 350. Not having enough resources and or the mods being pushed down the priority list. We certainly have been providing resources, or the network operators have been providing resources on our behalf into these code changes. I think we've been quite proactive in DCP 350. So I hope that we are continuing to provide useful input into that, and we'll obviously take the output from it. Statement of Works is going around another iteration at the moment. We're a bit at the mercy of the code modification process, but we are providing input, and we are at the moment in discussion with the ESO and the Code Mods group as to how we better reflect some of the Open Networks output on that. But that is underway and under the mods process. So, I mean, how do we ensure? We can never ensure that code changes get progressed in a timely manner because we are at the code modifications process. We're under their governance. But what we can do is try and provide the appropriate resources. And the key thing is to try and make sure that the work we've done up to the point that it's handed over to the code mod process is taken into account and they don't start again. And I think that is happening with DCP 350, if I'm going to be honest. Probably we haven't been as efficient in getting that for the Statement of Works mods, but we are continuing to provide our input into it. The last question, as we're at 3 o'clock, I think we'll just quickly do this. Are we going to develop a roadmap where perceived and real conflicts of interest of both A&M and contested services would be addressed? I think if you have any perceived or real conflicts of interest that you don't think are covered in our risk register, please have a look in there and send them in if you don't think we've covered them, because we've done a really quite a comprehensive risk analysis of conflicts of interest and unintended consequences within there. So, Iona, if there are elements you think aren't covered, I would really recommend and ask you to provide some input. And reinforcement versus flexibility. Reinforcement, we view reinforcement as being investment in the assets in the network, and flexibility being the procurement of services, which is largely what's covered under Workstream 1A. I'm going to draw that to a close on the Q&A. That has actually answered all of the questions, I think, that come through on the Q&A and chat. So I'm just going to wrap up with just saying, please respond. Consultation closes on the 17th of March. We do have another one of these webinars planned as per the slide at the beginning. Any questions, please do get in touch. If you want to get information around Open Networks, drop an email to us on opennetworks@energynetworks.org and we'll add you onto our distribution list. And I think that probably wraps it up, Nigel.
Yes, no, just thank you to everyone for joining the webinar.
Excellent. We've got a lot of participants today, so we really appreciate you taking an hour after your day to listen to us, and hopefully the answer to your questions was useful input. Okay, at that point, I think we will wrap up. So thank you all for your attention.